know, right, that this isn't about me, but there are two words I can't say on the radio.
There's more than two.
All right, fine. So it wasn't about me, but you are just making it about me now. I can't say Steve Bunce. That's something else I want to say instead. I can't say memorial very well, and I can't say addendum, which isn't
You want to
something...
be careful saying addendum, I can assure you.
I know. You feel a lot better after having one. But the addendums, I love at the end of books, all that stuff
so
that
do
you
I.
kind of
Big
wanted to fit in. And as part of Bunce's Tales of the Extraordinary, there have been a few that you've wanted to slot in Steve Bunce, I'm Caroline Barker.
Yeah.
And there's one from the last one where we were talking about Maurice Flitcroft.
The golfer at the Open.
And the panelled crane,
Yep.
which is the lasting image.
The wood panelled crane.
If you missed it, you can go and download it via the Five Live website and other podcast providers, etc. But there were some great names in that, and then there was one you missed out.
There was one I missed out. He had twin sons, Morris, before he went off and managed to nearly get into the Open. Tried for 12 years under about 7 different names, all of them beautiful names. But his son, who was called, it's a great name anyway, Gene Van Flitcroft, which is just beautiful. I mean,
and we don't know why.
It was such a mixture of whatever. Anyway, Gene Van Flitcroft, who was born about sort of 59ish in the mid 70s. He sort of followed his father, who was a crane driver but wanted to become a golfer, played in the Open. Yeah, listen to the podcast, you'll get it. So Gene wants to become a professional caddy, but he knows if he applies, the name Flitcroft's going to scare everybody. So he eventually gets work with Lee Trevino at proper tournaments in the UK. However, his caddy name, I've never known anybody have a caddy name. You have a stage name, don't you? You have to change your name sometimes in boxing because there's another John O'Toole. His caddy name, listen, I know we've gone on a little bit here. His caddy name was Troy Atlantic. So his real name was Gene Van Flitcroft, 1981 Malibu World Disco Dancing Champion. Wasn't bad on the roller skates either, but his caddy name when he worked with Lee Trevino, stop laughing, was Troy Atlantic.
Troy Atlantic were those videos right at the back of the shop. You used to go, well, I never went there.
We had a Ruben Bardo in the last show. We've got a Troy Atlantic in this one.
That was then. This is now. What's coming up this week?
The Kray twins. As boxers, we're going to look at fact, we're going to look at fiction, and in the middle, I'll try and make out whether they were any good or whether they were, to quote one or two people, absolutely rubbish.
Proper boxers, not round the corner and having a swift punch.
Well, let's try and get to the bottom of it, because everyone talks about the Krays being boxers.
Yeah.
There are pictures of them in the Repton gym in East London where they grew up in Bethnal Green. And they actually boxed. Let's get that right. When they were 11 and 12 and 13, their old dad took them to the boxing gym, the Repton. First of all, he took them to a gym in South London, not many people know this, called the Robert Browning. And it was in the Woolworth Road, basically between Camberwell and the Elephant and Castle, the Robert Browning. A great old club, sadly vanished about 25 years ago. So they went there first, long slap from Bethnal Green. They went back to the Repton, all in green, a boxing club set up in the 19th century by Repton School up in Staffordshire as a philanthropic venture into the East End. It was a way of reaching people in the slums with a sort of mission. Basically, it was a mission. Instead of going to India, Bush or darkest Africa, you go to the East End, 19th century. So it's called Repton. And they went there and started boxing, 11, 12, 13, 14 years of age. They both managed to win the Hackney schools, and they both managed to win the London schools. And Ronnie, who was the better of the two, he managed to get to the National Schoolboy Finals, I think, in 1948. So we know they've got a bit of form, if you'll excuse the expression, because later on they get plenty of form, as you well and truly know. So they did box, okay? And let's deal with that. They did box as amateur boxers when they were teenagers. And then they both decided when they were, I think, 18, that they turn professional. Now, this is a totally different thing. And this is where the myth starts to take over. And whether or not Ronnie and Reggie could actually box, or whether they were both rubbish, or one of them was rubbish, or what. So let's have a look at the raw stats and the raw facts. They both turned professional at the same time, July 1951.
What did professional mean then?
That meant they took off their vest and they actually they had to have a medical, and they fought on professional bills, so all around. Although they managed to fight in some fantastic locations. I mean, as you can imagine, they fought at places like Hoxton Town Hall and Lime Grove Baths. I mean, places that are now completely extinct because people don't need to go and have a... That's why they're called baths, because there were baths in them.
Yeah.
And, if you lived in a slum, you queued up on a Saturday morning or a Friday night and you got in a bath water, you've seen Quadrophenia, and you start singing and you have someone throw hot water in, more hot in number 4, and over it would come. And that is actually true. So they did this, they had this short career, lasted about 7 months. And the raw stats are quite simple, to be perfectly honest with you. Ronnie himself had 6 fights. He won 4, he lost 2. He was described by someone that knows him very well, a man called Tony Burns, who runs the Repton Gym. He was described as a crank. In fact, the quote that Burnsy told me back in the 1980s was quite simple. Ronnie, and he went quiet, Burnsy, he pulled on a cigarette, he was a crank. So I said, what about Reggie? He said, Reggie, no, he could box a bit. Oh, but only a little bit. Now, Reggie's professional record was 7 wins and no defeats. So, in all fairness, it's not that bad. They were there, but they were only 18 or 19 years of age at that particular time. But what they were already starting to do then was create this myth around themselves. By the time they were 18, 19, 20, they were having skirmishes, repeated skirmishes, and they were associating with boxing people. And somewhere between these associations and that little bit of professional boxing, 6 and 7 fights, this myth of what they could have become. So if you read one book by all of the different members, I mean, you know, the Kray gang, well, I don't know how many people are actually in the Kray gang, but there are at least 60 or 70 books out there by members of the Kray gang. I mean, how they weren't arrested earlier, in all fairness, there's 72 men walking down the street with Brill-creamed hair and suits on, for God's sake. I mean, they couldn't have been hard to find.
But who's pumping that out? Is that them?
Well, it's a bit them, and it's a bit people very willing in the late 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and even 90s, just churning out constantly these books. The boys who are not bothered, you know, the twins at this stage are well and truly ensconced in prison, walking around in Armani suits with the best sound systems in their prison rooms, listening to Mozart and Handel and stuff. I mean, it's just a ridiculous life. So let's get back to this mid-50s to late 50s, and their so-called great boxing careers. It lasted 7 months in 1951. 7 months. One had 6 fights, one had 7 fights. And what's happened? And I was with someone last weekend, a kid called Joey Pyle Jr., whose dad was called Joey Pyle Sr., I suppose. And Joey Pyle ran with the Krays and was acquitted of a couple of murders and was associated with them quite heavily, and may or may not have supplied this gun, or may not have supplied this knife that was used in various murders that ended up sending the 2 twins to prison until they died. And Joey Pyle Jr. said to me, and bear in mind, his father, I think, carried at least one of the coffins, maybe both. And Joey Pyle Jr. said to me, he said, Steve, have you found all of the fake stuff online? I said, yeah. I said, Joe, what's the story with it? He said, no one knows. So there are all these fake boxing posters. So they're made to look real. So it looks like they're two. So it's Ronnie Kray and there's some geezer called Sid Johnson or Sid Smith, and it'll be Manor Place Bar. So they use real venues, Royal Albert Hall, and they'll have Reggie or Ronnie's record as 57-0, 57 knockouts. Now what's happened over the years is that the advent of better record books and the computers and the various websites where you can check records. So those posters in the 60s, 70s and 80s would have sold as originals because it was near enough impossible, because they would have been boxing so far down an undercard they wouldn't have made the national press. So if in 1962 there's a poster that says they were boxing and it was 57-0, you have no way of checking it. The fact is it's complete and utter invention. And these are still selling to this day. You go onto eBay and other reputable places, you can buy these ridiculous fake boxing posters with their records. So what happens is, if you speak to people that even know a little bit about, let's say, boxing and London and the Krays, they all think they had 50, 60, 70 fights. They didn't. They had 6 and the other one had 7. It's really that simple. So forget all those ridiculous fake records. And of course then, what adds to the myth is that you have Reggie walking around. Now, Reggie is the one who was the better boxer, and he was, in theory, the sort of semi-sensible one, but he's the one that didn't get diagnosed as being certifiably criminally insane, paranoid schizophrenic, which was what happened to Ronnie. There's a fine line, though, between what Reggie was and what Ronnie was. That's obviously for sure. But Reggie's wandering around talking about, I broke at least 11 jaws. So they built their own myth, I suppose, is exactly what they do. Now, one way of looking at this, okay, if you want to be perfectly honest, is to get some testimony from men that were around them. So let's deal with Mickey Duff. Okay, Mickey Duff boxed in the 30s and the 40s, promoted in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and he knew inadvertently the Krays. He'd actually matched a couple of them. And what he said, and this again in conversation with me, basically, this is not basically, this is what he said. This is his exact quote to me was, they were both useless boxers, they were, especially Ronnie. He said, I used to look for the biggest cripples in the world for him to fight. Now, bear in mind, this interview took place in the early to mid-90s, so it's not necessarily particularly PC. But that didn't go unnoticed. And Mickey Duff, when he refused the twins access to his national sporting club in the Hilton in London in the 60s, and he went out to meet with them, and he explained, look, fellas, I've got some people there, and you're quite notorious at this stage. You can't come in, even though you've got this great association with boxing. So he refused them access. And then Mickey was a fight in America, an Ali fight in America, and his wife received through the post 4 dead rats. In fact, it's not the first story where dead rats arriving through the post or through the window. Anyway, so she received 4 dead rats through the window. And in fact, when he was arrested, this is an absolute true story, when Ronnie was arrested, okay, he had in his pocket, you'll love this, a list, okay, and in this list, this is how arrogant they were, right? Now listen, so they're killing people left, right, and centre. Let's not mince our words. There's 2 definite deaths where their hands, where they shoot people in public.
You see why people wouldn't argue with
No,
it.
exactly. Yeah. So this is in the mid-60s. I flow forward and leave their boxing career slightly. So he's got this list, okay. These men must die, okay. So the police are looking at it, they're going, oh, that'll do. But, I mean, Nipper Reid, who, by the way, worked for the British Boxing Board of Control after he retired from Scotland, he arrests them and he finds this bit of paper. And anyway...
It says that at the top of the list.
These men must die. Yeah. Now, this is apparently, I think it's in Ronnie's handwriting, these men must die. Anyway, very, very, very high on the list is Mickey Duff. Mickey Duff's name is very high on the list. And what he said, I've got a direct quote here from Ronnie. He said, I should have killed him when I had the chance. So that's another connection with boxing, not necessarily a very impressive one. Getting back to actually what they did and their violence, there is a guy, okay, who was a truly violent criminal and boxed at a much higher level. I'll give you a guy called Paul Sykes. Now, this guy's life, and this is one of those ones, Caroline, where you're going to try not to laugh because it's one of those things that's so dark that you sort of chuckle a little bit. You shouldn't chuckle. Paul Sykes was a bully, an absolute bully.
Right.
He's one of those guys. He was neck and neck for a long time in the 60s and 70s with Charles Bronson for the title of who was the meanest and the craziest man in prison. And he used to say, Sykes, I'm not a violent man, but I am an expert on violence. Anyway, sometime in the 70s, a brilliant behind-the-scenes documentary was made, probably for Grenada or something like that. And it went behind the scenes at Wakefield prison, where he was imprisoned for at that time he was about 28, and he'd been in prison basically since he was about 12, on and off. And when he was in there, he was hitting a punch bag, and he was talking about, I'll box this guy, I'll box that guy. And the British champion at the time was a guy called John L. Gardner. And he said, I'll come out and I'll knock out, his actual quote was, I will knock out Gardner and then have 750 birds, just like Joe Bugner. Yeah, I'm telling you, that's how they made documentaries back in the 70s, sister. Anyway, he did come out of prison. I've no idea on the bird count, but he did start training and he turned pro. And he had a couple of fights, and they finally matched him after about 8 fights. This really raw but tough guy was matched with John L. Gardner, who was a well-schooled boxer in about 30 fights. In fact, a planned fight with Muhammad Ali had fallen through. And it was at the Royal Albert Hall. And it was a massive crowd, a proper British heavyweight title fight, screened on the BBC.
Now, the man who's challenging for them is a very interesting character indeed. He's a man who's had only 8 professional fights so far. His name is Paul Sykes, and he comes from Wakefield. And he's a man who says that he owes boxing much of what he's got out of life, because boxing has helped him to lift himself out of a rather bad rut. In fact, he doesn't mind us telling you that he has spent a fair part of his life in jail. Of indeterminate age, it's appeared in the newspapers anything from 29 to 34. I suspect he's somewhere between 30 and 32.
Presenting from Hackney, the champion, John L. Gardner. Wakefield, the challenger, Paul Sykes.
Something horrible happened that night, and I'm not squeamish under any circumstances, but the referee let the fight go on far too long. So Paul Sykes was forced to take the most outrageous beating until it was finally called off in about round 8. So Paul Sykes, who had been a very violent man, who did achieve a little bit of boxing fame and notoriety by actually fighting for a British title, but he achieved more fame and notoriety because he was then followed for a follow-up documentary. And in this follow-up documentary, he terrorised his 2 young sons. I mean, he terrorised them. It's brutal. If you're a parent, it's horrible to watch. He terrorised his 2 young sons. Fast forward 25 years. All 3 of them are living rough on the streets of Wakefield. All 3 of them, the 2 sons and the dad. The dad's constantly being arrested. The 2 sons are constantly being arrested. Anyway, in a space, I think it was 18 months, about 15 years ago, both sons end up killing other destitute men, other basically what we used to call tramps. They both get convicted, and when Paul Sykes eventually dies of liver damage, both of his sons, who he terrorised when he was a young man freshly released from prison, were in prison serving life sentences for murder. I'll take you back to. Sorry, Caroline. I can do laughs. I can do tricks and jokes if you like. I can make rabbits appear from my pocket.
You know, that's what makes the highs so high when you have the lows there too. It's just a point of view where you just go, what, 3 lives wasted.
3 lives wasted. So getting back a little bit to the Krays. So they have this incredible association with boxing, you know, but really the reality is they had 6 and 7 fights, and that's absolutely about it. However, one of the things that happens in the mid-60s is a former world light heavyweight champion called Freddie Mills from Bournemouth, who eventually ends up in Soho running a couple of clubs, and he's eventually found dead. And there's a lot of death in this. There's a lot of death in this show.
You told me beforehand.
Download this one, please, at midnight. Anyway, there's a lot. So this guy, Freddie Mills, is found dead in his car outside his nightclub in Soho, and the bullet goes through his eye. And the autopsy pictures are out there. You can Google them and find them. And it's worked out that he couldn't have actually killed himself. So it's ruled a suicide, but it's doubtful whether he could have done it with the rifle that he was using in the car. And lo and behold, there's always been all these great conspiracy theories that the Krays were putting pressure on him and he should be added to their list of deaths and misdemeanors. He wasn't added to the list of deaths and misdemeanors, and there's enough evidence to suggest that he may have been involved. Well, a crime journalist from the 60s, has just written a book in the last 4 or 5 months about the death of Freddie Mills, and he's come up with an incredible claim. He has claimed that Freddie Mills was in such terrible straits that he wanted to kill himself, but he couldn't be sure would be able to do it. So he hired the Krays for £1,000 to kill himself, to have himself topped. I mean, you can't. Listen, that's a book. It's a best-selling sports book, one of the best-selling sports books at the moment. So even at the end, they were sucked back further and closer to the world of boxing. So the Krays, in an absolute nutshell, they weren't very good as boxers. One of them was particularly poor. The other one was okay for a 19-year-old who managed to win 7 contests. That all ended in 1951. The 2 of them died about 30-odd years later with nothing more than an association with boxing. And that list that one of them had in their wallet, the men must die, which I call a death list. But what Reggie had in his wallet was a picture of a young boxer called Terry Spinks, who in 1956 won an Olympic gold medal when he was about 17. And Terry Spinks always looked, of course, very young, up until probably he was about 70 years of age. He still looked like he was a kid. But the particular picture in question in his wallet made him a very youthful looking Terry Spinks. So they were close to boxing. They were connected to boxing. But anything you've heard about the 2 Krays could have been champions, could have been contenders. It is absolute and complete rubbish. Not an ounce of truth to it. And as Mickey Duff said, you had to look for the biggest, some of the worst opponents possible just to get them a win.
I didn't wake up this morning thinking, I want to know about the Krays' boxing career. But now I have so many questions.
Go on, go.
I'm sure others do as well.
Fire away.
You're open to questions, right?
Oh, yeah,
you don't mind.
questions,
There's
baby.
not a list in your pocket that I need to know about, is there? Those that fought the Krays, that
that's
that lost
interesting.
to them. Has anyone spoken to them? Have they ever spoken about it?
No, all of the guys that they beat and the guys that beat them all had ridiculous jobbing records. Like, for instance, we got this record here. We've got Reggie, who managed to get 7 wins. He only boxed 2 men with winning records. So most of the men he fought had won 2 and lost 14. So you were going to win anyway. And they were just jobbing pros, guys that ended up having 50, 60, 70 contests. So they were just guys that were on the circuit. At that point, no, see, this is the thing. At that point, they were only 17 and 18 years of age when they turned pro. So they were unknown still. So unless you came from Bethnal Green, you wouldn't have known much about them. Although, of course, they'd been up to various degrees of thuggery, intimidation. That's what they were. They were enforcers. They intimidated people into doing what they wanted, which was generally paying them money for some kind of service. So if you came from Mitcham, you didn't know anything about the Krays. They were too small. There were dozens of other gangs in London at the time, mostly Maltese gangs, sometimes even Italian extraction. Loads of other gangs in London at the time. You knew about them, but you didn't know about these 2 17-year-old twins from East London. So no, there was no fear when they were actually boxing. Again, that's one of the great myths.
And those names that were on those fake posters you spoke about, just briefly, were they all made up too? Or
No, semi-made up. I mean, I think we've encountered 1 or 2 fake names as we've gone through these extraordinary tales, where people just sort of invented names. So what's a common London name in the 50s? Archie. What's the rest of it? Smith or Sexton? Yeah, we'll have Sexton. I mean, it was that type of thing. You know? So they ring true, but it's not quite true.
Very much like the stories. Although I know they're all
easy.
true.
Oh, listen, every single thing is traceable. I mean, Mickey Duff's quotes, I mean, he did write his book and he did talk to me. Everything he said about them was after the pair of them had died. But at the time, in fact, he took them on a little bit, and in fact, he threatened them. They said to him, well, you know, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go to the police. He said, and I'm going to be, and the quote was, and I'm going to be the best informer they've ever had. And that shut them up a little bit.
I started by saying addendum, which I just wanted to
very
say
well.
because I couldn't say it anymore. The addendum to the Krays will come in next week's show, no doubt.
Well, listen, you never know, do you, with a Krays?
No.
You never know how it's going to end.
But what else will you be revealing?
Well, actually, the Krays may not feature next week. Well, they could feature a lot later in the series.
I might have another question.
You might have, but they might feature a lot later in the series when we do a man called Nosha Powell. And that's his real name. Well, it's actually Fred Nosha Powell. Now, next week, there is, and this is a very bad joke, it was given to me earlier on, there will be a serious sea change next week when we go in to the waters off of the North Shore of Hawaii for the greatest day of sport ever. Now, that's a bold claim. I'm making it. Get your thinking hat on. See you next week.
What racks up against it? I mean, can I have some criteria? I'll think about those.
Period. No, I'm talking. No, I'm not. I'm
ever.
not saying the greatest sporting day in the history of surfing. I'm saying the greatest day of sport in the history. Period.
Who am I to argue with a man in a Hawaiian shirt?
I'm telling you.
You've been listening to Bunce's Tales of the Extraordinary.